When the letter arrived in the mail, my stomach sank before I even opened it. It was not the kind of correspondence one looks forward to, a thick, official envelope stamped with the insignia of the Homeowners Association, a bureaucratic emblem that had always felt harmless, until now. I carefully sliced open the envelope, trying to ignore the knot forming in my chest. Inside was a letter that would turn a peaceful summer morning into a storm of anxiety and frustration. It claimed, in precise legalistic terms, that my cabin, my sanctuary, the culmination of years of work and devotion, was built illegally. According to the HOA, it violated zoning laws, construction permits, and an obscure regulation that I had never heard of in my entire life. My immediate reaction was a mix of disbelief and anger. How could something that had stood for decades, a small but cherished part of the community, suddenly be deemed illegal? I had meticulously ensured that everything in and around the cabin were compliant with local codes. I had consulted contractors, checked permits, and followed every rule the county required. Yet here I was, accused of some grave architectural sin, and the letter demanded immediate rectification, fines, possible demolition, and a list of penalties that seemed designed to terrify rather than inform. At first, I thought perhaps this was a mistake, a bureaucratic mix-up. After all, the cabin had existed for generations, a fixture of the property long before any of today's HOA regulations were enacted. I had seen other properties nearby with additions and modifications that seemed far more questionable, and yet those homeowners had never received such a threatening notice. The inconsistency stung. It felt personal. I spent the next few hours rereading the letter, dissecting every sentence, every implication. There was no leeway, no room for negotiation. It was as if they had prepared this case in advance, waiting for the opportunity to pounce on someone who cared enough to maintain a property with pride and attention. The accusations cut deeper than just legal concerns. They challenged the very legitimacy of my family's presence in this place, the history embedded in every wooden beam, every hand-forged nail, every small corner of the cabin that bore the marks of care and craftsmanship. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to hear them out, though I was already bracing for confrontation. Walking into the boardroom that evening, I could feel the tension in the air, a quiet authority that seemed to radiate from the polished table and the stern faces of the board members. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a mixture of formality and fatigue that reminded me of countless similar gatherings I had attended over the years. As the meeting began, they wasted no time presenting their case. The board president spoke with a tone that was both measured and intimidating, outlining the alleged violations with precision that left no room for doubt, or so they assumed. They showed diagrams, legal excerpts, and photographs, some of which were distorted or taken at odd angles to exaggerate minor imperfections. The way they presented it made it seem as if my cabin was a ticking time bomb, ready to collapse under the weight of its supposed illegality. I listened carefully, jotting notes, trying not to react emotionally, though inside I was simmering. Every word they said felt like an attack on decades of my family's labor, on a heritage that had been passed down through generations, preserved not for profit or aesthetics alone, but for the love of the place itself. The other homeowners in attendance offered little support. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others whispered quietly among themselves. It was clear that the HOA wielded influence, and few wanted to challenge them openly. Their silence made me feel oddly isolated, as if I had become the embodiment of defiance against a faceless bureaucracy that thrived on control and conformity. Questions I tried to ask were often interrupted or dismissed with phrases like "that's irrelevant" or "please stick to the matter at hand," which only increased my frustration. I realized quickly that this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a psychological one. They were testing my resolve, attempting to intimidate me into submission. But as much as I wanted to walk out, to avoid a confrontation that seemed both unfair and unnecessary, I knew I couldn't. This cabin was more than wood and nails. It was a repository of memories, a testament to the generations who had lived, laughed, and labored here. Letting them dictate its fate without resistance was unthinkable. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in research, digging through local zoning codes, construction regulations, and historical property records. I even visited the county archives, a place that smelled of dust, ink, and time itself, filled with rows upon rows of old deeds, permits, and town planning documents. Each record I unearthed confirmed what I had always suspected. The cabin was built long before many of the current regulations existed. The thought that modern bureaucracy could retroactively deem such a structure illegal seemed absurd, yet here it was, staring me in the face. I began compiling evidence, photographs, and testimonies from neighbors who had lived in the community for decades, hoping to construct a defense robust enough to withstand the HOA scrutiny. The deeper I delved, the more I realized how delicate the situation had become. A single misstep, a poorly worded reply, or a missed deadline could give them the leverage they needed to enforce their threats. The stakes were higher than mere compliance. They were about legitimacy, history, and the right to protect a piece of my family's legacy from arbitrary authority. The emotional toll was immense. Nights became restless, filled with anxious thoughts of lawyers, fines, and the unthinkable possibility of demolition. Days were consumed by frantic research, calls to local historians, and consultations with contractors who could validate the age and authenticity of the structure. Each interaction with the HOA, whether via email or phone, was a reminder of the imbalance of power. They had resources, legal counsel, and the ability to pressure homeowners into compliance, while I had only determination, evidence, and an unshakable belief in the rightness of my position. Despite this, I refused to let fear dictate my actions. Every step I took was deliberate. Every document I uncovered a brick in the wall of my defense. I began to see the dispute not merely as a confrontation, but as a test of persistence, knowledge, and the courage to stand firm against an organization that underestimated the strength of historical truth. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I was prepared, though still wary. I had a folder thick with evidence, photographs documenting the cabin over decades, copies of historical zoning approvals, and letters from neighbors affirming the cabin's existence long before modern regulations took shape. Walking back into that boardroom, I felt a mixture of apprehension and quiet confidence. This was my moment to assert not just legality, but legitimacy, history, and the principle that one cannot erase the past with threats and paperwork alone. As the board members began their presentation once more, I opened my folder and prepared to speak, knowing that this dispute was far from over, but that I was ready to face it head-on, armed with the most powerful defense one can have: proof, persistence, and the truth. The day I decided to unearth the cabin's history felt almost ritualistic. I returned to my attic, a dusty repository of forgotten memories, where cobwebs clung to wooden beams and the faint scent of old paper lingered in the air. Boxes stacked haphazardly for decades held fragments of my family's past, letters, photographs, and deeds that had long been ignored. Among them, I found what I had been hoping for: the original property deed, dated 1882, its edges yellowed and brittle, yet the ink still dark enough to read the careful handwriting of a long-past scribe. My hands trembled slightly as I held it, not from fear but from the weight of what this fragile paper represented. This was more than legal proof. It was a tangible link to the generations who had walked the land, built the cabin, and nurtured it through time. It was irrefutable evidence that my cabin had existed long before any of the HOA's rules or regulations. I arrived at the next HOA meeting armed with a deed, feeling a mixture of nervousness and quiet triumph. The board members, as always, were poised and authoritative, their expression set in polite indifference. I could sense the same tension in the air that had accompanied our first confrontation months ago, but now I held something they could not easily dismiss. When it was my turn to speak, I placed the 1882 deed carefully on the table in front of them as if presenting a sacred artifact. Their eyes flicked down at it, curiosity mingling with disbelief. I began to narrate the story it told: the original granting of the land, the early construction of the cabin, and the continuity of ownership through the generations. I traced the lines of ink with my finger, pointing to signatures and dates, explaining how every detail affirmed the cabin's legitimacy. The room, once filled with bureaucratic certainty, seemed to shift subtly under the weight of history. The reaction was immediate and palpable. The board members leaned in, scrutinizing the document with a newfound intensity. Questions they had asked so confidently before about zoning, permits, and alleged violations suddenly lacked context. The room, previously filled with their air of authority, became quiet. Their confident assertions wavered, replaced by hesitant murmurs and exchanged glances. I could see their minds racing to reconcile the undeniable proof before them with the complaints they had issued weeks earlier. For the first time, the dispute was no longer about conjecture or technicalities. It was about the plain truth of history. Every objection they had made crumbled beneath the evidence, leaving only the reality that my cabin had stood legally and legitimately for well over a century. The discussion that followed was almost surreal. One board member, who had previously been particularly antagonistic, leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his forehead, his earlier confidence replaced with what looked like a reluctant acknowledgement. Another member, usually stern and immovable, admitted quietly that the deed changed everything. I answered their questions patiently, providing context, clarifying ambiguities, and gently guiding them through the timeline. I could feel a shift not just in the room, but in the atmosphere itself. The tension, once thick and oppressive, began to dissolve, replaced by a shared recognition of the cabin's historical and legal validity. What had begun as a confrontation now seemed more like a revelation, an awakening to the truth that history cannot be rewritten by a single letter or modern rulebook. As the meeting drew to a close, the board's final words were cautious, tinged with humility. They acknowledged that the cabin was legally protected under its historical status and that the HOA had no grounds to pursue fines, demolition, or further action. Their earlier threats seemed almost comical in retrospect, like shadows dissipating in the light of undeniable proof. The victory, however, was not just legal, it was profoundly personal. I felt a deep sense of vindication, not from having won against the HOA, but from honoring the legacy of those who had come before me. The cabin, once under threat, was reaffirmed as a rightful part of the community, a living testament to history and perseverance. Walking back to the cabin after the meeting, deeds safely tucked away, I could finally breathe. The air seemed lighter, the sunlight warmer, as if nature itself recognized the end of the conflict. I paused on the porch, looking out over the familiar landscape, the towering pines, the gently sloping hills, and the creek that whispered past the property boundary. Each detail, each memory embedded in this place, felt more precious than ever. The confrontation with the HOA had been stressful, exhausting, and at times demoralizing, but it had also strengthened my connection to the land, to my family's history, and to the very essence of the cabin itself. I realized that sometimes battles over legality and authority are not just about rules. They are about protecting identity, heritage, and the stories embedded in every corner of the spaces we call home. In the days that followed, neighbors who had quietly observed the dispute reached out, offering congratulations and expressing admiration for my persistence. Some admitted they had doubted the cabin's status, while others confessed they had feared confronting the HOA themselves. I smiled at their honesty, understanding the pressures of bureaucracy and the fear it instills in even the most confident homeowners. The deed had done more than silence the board. It had sparked conversations about history, preservation, and the importance of standing firm when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. My cabin, once threatened by rules it had long outlived, had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the past, when honored and documented, has the power to protect the present. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast long shadows over the cabin, I sat on the porch with a quiet satisfaction. The conflict with the HOA was over, but the lessons remained. Persistence pays off, knowledge is power, and history, once uncovered and understood, can be an unbeatable defense. Holding the 1882 deed in my hands had been more than a legal victory. It had been a journey into the past, a reconnect on with the roots of my family and the legacy of the land. The cabin stood as it always had, solid, enduring, and rightful, a monument to the truth that sometimes the simplest pieces of paper can carry the heaviest weight, and that defending what is yours sometimes means looking to history itself for strength.